Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Chapter 15, Strategic International Information Operations.
From 1776 to 1945, the U.S. system of government managed to survive in a world comprising many types of government without setting up its own propaganda and agitational forces. Propaganda through most of the 20th century was pretty clearly limited by the U.S. conception of propaganda as a weapon auxiliary to war. Psychological warfare became proper, in conventional American terms, only when there was a war to be won. With the coming of peace in 1945, there was considerable uncertainty as to whether the United States should have a propaganda establishment at all. Even at the time of writing, 1954, there is still some doubt as to whether the United States needs propaganda facilities. The William Jackson Report of July 1953 indicated that the terms propaganda and psychological warfare were unsatisfactory. Of course they were. They still are. The world itself is unsatisfactory, in terms of the traditional, humane, rational U.S. point of view. The story of U.S. peacetime propaganda since the end of World War II is a very complicated one. Quantity, direction, purpose, and quality have shifted with the various turns of the international situation. The subject has become much more difficult to write about since the time the first edition of this book was written in 1946. In the first place, governmental secrecy has been very sharply restored. Even very routine State Department operations for putting across the U.S. point of view have been shrouded in masses of classified documents. For reasons not always evident to the outside observer, the assumption has become prevalent that the normal operations of the United States government should be kept confidential, secret, or even top secret. Often it would seem that the attempt to maintain secrecy in non-sensitive functions is not worth the security effort at all, or contrariwise, may even reassure the antagonists of the United States by not letting them realize how serious and how unfriendly our plans or policies with respect to them may be. This is not the time or place to discuss the problem of secrecy as a protection against domestic criticism, which secrecy, of course, has often become, to the detriment of both the government and the citizens of the United States. In the second place, not only have information activities become more hush-hush, they have also become more complicated. It is difficult to do justice to an intricate moving panorama of activities, some of which may not be mentioned or described under existing law: demobilization and remobilization. The ending of the WWII and the installation of the International Information Service, mentioned above, in turn changed into the information activities of the Department of State. These were headed from 1945 to 1953 by an Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. In 1953, a director of the United States Information Agency, not under the Department of State but mysteriously attached to the National Security Council, was inaugurated. The overseas operating component of USIA remained the United States Information Service, USIS, transferred from State Department control. In other words, there were 8 years in which the Department of State had primary responsibility for the conduct of peacetime propaganda of the United States. This was the first and only time that the United States government had, in a period of relative peace, undertaken a sustained propaganda effort. The effort had ups and downs because neither the citizenry nor the officials knew whether the country was in a condition of peace or at war, and if at war with whom. To some the enemy was communism, the ideology; to others, communism the movement; to still others, the USSR; to others, the Korean communists, but not the Chinese communists; to others, the Chinese communists in Korea, but not the Chinese communists in China, and so on ad infinitum. The general history of these 8 years was, by and large, a first phase in which the United States demobilized or destroyed propaganda facilities which had been built up with great skill and at great cost during World War II, and a second phase in which those facilities were partially rebuilt and the skills rediscovered. The low point in this development was probably the winter of 1947 to 48. For a while, the rumor went around Washington that the Secretary of Defense, Louis Johnson, would not tolerate the utterance of the words propaganda or psychological warfare, and that the Secretary of the Army, Kenneth C. Royal, refused to have the topic mentioned to him. That may be the exaggeration characteristic of newspapermen, but it epitomized the spirit of that time. While psychological warfare almost disappeared from the Department of Defense and the three services during this low point, the State Department never quite demobilized. For one thing, the State Department had inherited the WWII facilities and the Army facilities in the occupied countries, Austria, Germany, Korea, and Japan. As the heir to substantial informational facilities, the State Department kept a certain minimum activity going. Facilities such as American Broadcasting Station in Europe, ABSE, radio in the American sector of Berlin, RIAS, the Information Control Commands in the American sector of Germany, Information and Education, I&E, section of the General Headquarters of the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SGAP, in Japan. These, though sometimes renamed, represented going propaganda concerns which required a Washington command post. Meanwhile, it became standing operating procedure in the U.S. diplomatic establishment to attach some kind of an informational facility to every diplomatic establishment and to most of the major consulates. Since there were always advocates of complete propaganda dismantlement, as well as enthusiasts for the maintenance of information programs, the issue of remaining in the propaganda business or getting out was always more or less in doubt. The economy and the demobilization phases of 1947 and 1948 were stimulated by evidence of Soviet bad faith in Europe during 1949 and brought into sharp focus by the outbreak of the Korean semi-war in 1950. It is not possible to do justice to all these different systems in a single phrase. Even as late as the present, it is sometimes difficult to determine why the U.S. need have an information program operating in such entirely friendly countries as Cuba, Haiti, Ireland, or Australia. There is some point to the argument set forth by ultra-conservatives that what was good enough for Theodore Roosevelt ought to be good enough today. That, in other words, the United States should be known for what it is and not by what a few hired promoters can say about it. As in so many other fields of activities, however, the past is irrecoverable. The United States can no more return to the pre-atomic age in propaganda matters than it can in defense matters. The world we have built is with us, and the only alternative to survival seems death. With respect to the specific field of propaganda, this leads to occasional curious political alliances. Sometimes the conservatives in U.S. politics are so conservative they want no propaganda at all. At other times, these same conservatives are so anti-communist that they want more propaganda. On occasions, the left within the USA has viewed U.S. propaganda with alarm, and at other times has demanded that there be more of it and that more of the content be left. Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs. The Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs has been the principal officer of government responsible for the conduct of U.S. propaganda during 1945 to 53. His successor, the Director of the United States Information Agency, faces very closely related problems. Fortunately, one of these Assistant Secretaries of State has written an excellent book relating his experiences and the problems of his office in detail. Edward W. Barrett, in his Truth is Our Weapon, New York, 1953, describes his own experiences with 2 years in that position. The Assistant Secretary had the help of an interdepartmental committee, which under various labels and with various degrees of secrecy, attempted to coordinate the foreign informational activities of the various departments of the United States government to common goals. Later, as will be described, the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs was supplemented by a psychological strategy board outside of the Department of State, and still later by a White House assistant in charge of informational policies at the highest level. What can be said of this first U.S. peacetime performance in the propaganda field? The assistant secretaries themselves have been men of varied capacities and interests. Mr. Barrett was an OWI veteran and a journalist of high standing. George Allen was a tough-minded career diplomat. Howland Sargent was a distinguished government official. William Benton was the founder of the most successful canned music system for restaurants, and the most vigorous promoter which the Encyclopedia Britannica ever had. Later he became a senator. Men such as these can scarcely be called tight-lipped fanatics emerging from the hidden recesses of a U.S. Politburo. They and their colleagues did a surprisingly good job. American travelers overseas were often amazed to find that the U.S. propaganda effort was far more polished and purposeful than an observer within the United States could expect it to be. The activities of the Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs consisted of supervising the domestic origination of broadcasts directed to the Soviet Union, the satellite countries, neutrals, and friends. The radio system was generally known as the Voice of America. To this degree, he had charge of a propaganda system operated within the United States by Americans, but speaking to foreigners, sometimes by transmitters located within the USA, and more often with relay transmitters which picked up programs originating in the continental United States and rebroadcast overseas. One echelon removed, there were installations attached to the diplomatic and consular establishments of the United States, which were usually known as USIS, although in some particular cases, quasi-private facilities were sponsored instead. In each foreign country, there was at the embassy or legation level a public affairs officer, PAO, who was the information specialist for the diplomatic mission, and in theory at least, in charge of all U.S. propaganda or informational activities, whichever one preferred to call them, in the country to which he was accredited. A complex hierarchy of officials routed, relayed, screened, and coordinated programs from headquarters to the PAOs in the field, and proposals or requests from the PAOs back to headquarters. Other U.S. facilities. A complicated element in the State Department's conduct of propaganda was the fact that at no time did the State Department enjoy even a monopoly of the governmental mass communications of the United States abroad. It goes without saying that at no time did the State Department achieve or seek control of private U.S. mass communications, such as the international editions of Time and Newsweek, the circulation of American books and magazines on a commercial basis, commercial American-owned publications abroad, or the like. At the very least level of competition, the State Department had the Armed Forces Radio Service, AFRS, broadcasting to most of the countries in which the State Department was active, often broadcasting in quite a different tone of voice and with very different content. In many instances, foreigners who understood English preferred to listen to the lively radio programs transmitted for the edification of U.S. service personnel stationed abroad, rather than to listen to canned programs made up for the benefit of themselves as a foreign target. The author has seen Chinese shopkeepers in Singapore listen very seriously to a sergeant giving the news of the day at dictation speed from an armed services transmitter somewhere in the Pacific Ocean area. In 1948, there was virtually no coordination between the armed services and the Department of State. As time went on, the two sets of U.S. broadcasts took a certain amount of note of each other. Coordination was not as easy as it might seem on paper. After all, what is one to do? Is it valid to propagandize our innocently cherubic service personnel abroad, whom so many domestic purity leagues and local pressure groups are anxious to defend? After all, these service people possess fearful weapons. Each has a congressman to whom he might write. But if service personnel in a foreign country are to be given non-propaganda materials, how can the same area be given propaganda materials for the benefit of the indigenous personnel? The propaganda from the United States government must not be too much at variance with the non-propaganda of the United States government. If the two extremes of communication were too far apart, the United States government might look like an ass. That would be most unhappy. Over and above the contradictions and difficulties involved in the operation of at least two governmental systems and many private systems of U.S. news communication and dissemination systems in foreign areas, there is the further problem of additional U.S. facilities. Sources such as the Washington Post, Joseph Alsop, James Reston, and other well-informed Washington journalists often hinted gloomily and darkly that U.S. cloak-and-dagger operations are still going on. Dorothy Thompson was often troubled by what she regarded as the feckless successors of the wartime OSS. Many times, Americans resident in local areas concerned seem never to have heard of the hush-hush operations in their own overseas homes, operations which were denounced with purple prose in Washington. We can say that covert operations, when they have been really uncovered, as in the case of the Time story about overzealous U.S. support of a German nationalist resistance group, turn out to be much more pale than the lurid columnists or inside stories from Washington would lead one to believe. More serious have been the duplication and triplication and occasional quadruplication of official informational activities. The Overseas Economic and Military Aid Program, known successively as Economic Cooperation Administration, ECA, Mutual Security Administration, MSA, and Foreign Operations Administration, FOA, has not only supplemented the existing leaflet, broadcast, and other informational activities of the State Department and the Armed Forces with a third set of information programs, it has itself had a fourth rival in the Point 4 Administration, the Technical Cooperation Administration, TCA, which was both a part of state and not a part of state, depending upon the particular situation overseas. Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia. Over and above the government's operations in this field, there have been the quasi-private undertakings of the Committee for a Free Europe and the Committee for a Free Asia. These have been privately sponsored and privately financed by altruistic organizations dedicated to broadcasting those things which the State Department finds it impolitic to put on the air. The degree of governmental contribution or participation is not known, although it is often touched upon in the U.S. press. That the organizations are to a definite extent private is evident in their ability to broadcast local and controversial news to particular Iron Curtain countries, and by the fund drives which they have waged with little contribution boxes inside the USA. The advantage of the RFE and RFA type of operation is that by giving voice to independent non-governmental resistance to communism, it has often been possible to go far beyond the limits which intergovernmental protocol would impose upon U.S. official broadcasts. That is, the United States can scarcely describe a deputy minister in the Romanian government as a scoundrel, thief, pervert, or renegade. Romanian exiles allowed access to Radio Free Europe stations need have no such limitations. On the other hand, there is the difficulty that Radio Free Europe, because of its U.S.-based finance and management, might lend an unnecessary U.S. sponsorship to genuinely independent anti-communist undertakings. Here again, as in the case of the reconciliation of the State Department and defense broadcasts, it is impossible to draw a doctrinal rule which would prescribe on one hand that all propaganda broadcasts should be unofficial or that they should all be official. One cannot even say that they should all be coordinated. The Psychological Strategy Board. Coordination was nevertheless attempted, at least for the governmental side. In 1951, President Truman created the Psychological Strategy Board, bringing the versatile and judicious Gordon Gray back to Washington for the purpose. The prescribed role of the board was to coordinate, plan, and phase all United States information policies so as to achieve maximum effect from the governmental effort. Not once did the board dare reach out for a penny's worth of jurisdiction over private U.S. facilities. The Psychological Strategy Board was only originally under the chairmanship of the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, then General Walter Bedell Smith, with the members of the board consisting of the Undersecretary of State, the Undersecretary of Defense, and the Deputy Director of what was at the time known as ECA, later MSA. The board had a series of able staff directors and small staffs detailed from other government departments on a permanent basis to serve as a working secretariat. The precise operations of the board were cloaked in extraordinary secrecy. It cannot be said that U.S. propaganda worsened in the 2 years following the establishment of the board. Neither can it be said that U.S. psy-war operations scored any coups so striking as to deserve a position in the annals of international affairs. William Jackson Report. After the Republicans came into office in 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower moved to overhaul the information establishment. He appointed a committee under the chairmanship of William Jackson, a former OSS official and investment banker, and under the secretaryship of Abbott Washburn, who had headed the superlatively successful advertising department of General Mills Incorporated which had successfully given away millions of prizes for millions of box tops from cereals consumed by American youth or flowers relished by the American housewife. Some of the liberal press commentators eyed the committee gloomily as it went to work. Nevertheless, that portion of its report, which was made public, turned out to be a document of remarkable finesse and sophistication. The report, released in July 1953, pointed out the Psychological Strategy Board had erred in trying to plan informational activities in its own light, instead of considering the informational aspects of every single U.S. government activity possessing international significance. The report recommended the replacement of the Psychological Strategy Board by a more realistic policy coordinating organization, which would coordinate not merely propaganda policies, but all policies, and, having coordinated all policies, would then resolve upon maximum psychological exploitation of the policies which had been decided. In a sense, this is rather like saying that the United States should have a president, since the powerful chief executive of this government has, since 1789, been the final arbiter of executive matters, both foreign and domestic. In another sense, it can be interpreted to mean that the responsibilities of the presidency are so great that no one man could perform in his head all the staff work necessary to see through the opinion reactions which might develop abroad to U.S. executive decisions made here at home. If the latter supposition is true, it means that the United States is saddled with one more intricate governmental process, made necessary by the closeness, dangerousness, and importance of international affairs in the lives of Americans and their government. Operations Coordinating Board. On the 3rd of September 1953, President Eisenhower, then at Denver, Colorado, issued an executive order abolishing the Psychological Strategy Board and creating the Operations Coordinating Board. According to informed press comment at the time, it was the intention of the White House to carry out the recommendation to this effect made by the President's Committee on International Information Activities. The new board was located immediately under the National Security Council. C.D. Jackson was a significant member of the board, but not as chairman. The chairman was Walter Bedell Smith. Besides General Smith, then Under Secretary of State, the board included Harold E. Stassen, Director of the Foreign Operations Administration, Allen W. Dulles, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Roger M. Keyes, Deputy Secretary of Defense. The President also directed that Theodore C. Stribert, Director of the U.S. Information Service, make himself available. Insofar as this development represented an attempt to coordinate the framing of U.S. government policy in such a manner as to achieve maximum impact on the rest of the world, it represented a major step forward. The de-emphasis of psychological warfare, or psychological strategy, as operations which could somehow or other be efficacious without a context of material support through the real-life behavior of the government issuing the propaganda, was a healthy sign indeed. Psychological warfare is at best a cumbersome and pretentious label for an important modern political and military weapon, the use of mass communication. The definition of empirical psychological warfare, given in Chapter 3, and reproduced as it was originally written in 1946, makes it perfectly plain that the term acquires specificity, which is made plain by the particular individualities involved undertaking the operation at any given time. Psychological warfare is not an ancient term which is so well defined by the usage of centuries that modern men would be ill-advised to redefine it or to sweep it aside. Indeed, the basic weakness of the term psychological warfare is its pretentiousness within American civilization of the 1900s. No one now knows whether the United States of the 1960s will turn out to be dynamic, forward-looking, insistent upon its own view of the world. It is difficult in the 1950s to see how the next decade or so could bring forth anything as explosive or violent in the social and political field as the atomic bomb has been in the field of fission. The United States certainly does not seem to be on the threshold of a new Islam. For better or for worse, the U.S. strengths are the strengths of sobriety, calmness, health. They are the strengths of living as opposed to the strengths of revolution. Revolution may be strong. It may even be pleasurable to some persons involved. But as Dennis W. Brogan has pointed out in his The Price of Revolution, Boston 1952, revolution has a cost factor which must be weighed against the results expected from it. In the context of mid-20th century affairs, it is almost pitiable and endearing to see us Americans of this time, who are so little given to the drama of fanaticism or the salvation of the world through cruelty, attempting to dramatize our own modest and reasonable operations by giving them melodramatic and pretentious labels. If the communists torment us long enough, they may make us into alert brutes. This seems doubtful now. It seems probable that we will continue to be brave without becoming fiendish in combat, strong without becoming ferocious in peace. Varying definitions of psy-war are adopted by official agencies from time to time. The current 1953 Joint Chiefs of Staff definition runs as follows. Psychological warfare comprises the planned use of propaganda and related informational measures designed to influence the opinions, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of enemy or other foreign groups in such a way as to support the accomplishment of national policies and aims or a military mission. This definition differs from the one given in Chapter 3 in the following important respects. It stresses the planned character of psy-war. It restricts the pertinent measures to those of an informational character, and it makes clear the operational goals. It is not clear why it is necessary to stress the element of planning of psy-war as distinguished from other sorts of war, unless it is a homily to the psy-war operator to keep his functions in line with those of other national activities. The question of restriction to informational character is more serious. It excludes the interpretation that, in essence, psychological warfare depends upon warfare psychologically waged. Thus, substantive operations of a non-informational character, adopted and executed primarily for their psychological effect, could properly be called psy-war. Finally, the specification of goals is chiefly important for the control of the function, and can largely be taken for granted. Therefore, to preserve an inclusive view of the function, which will comprise the range of variation in official definitions, including those of one's enemies, the author stands by the definition stated in 1946. Limitations of the American originators. There are illusions about psychological warfare, illusions spread, in many cases, by the overenthusiastic friends of this kind of operation. Excessive claims have been made for the efficacy of propaganda. Sometimes psychological warfare has even been offered as a substitute for war or for diplomacy. On other occasions, Americans have asked that their government do as well as this or that foreign government in the propaganda field, forgetting that the United States is a republic and a democracy, and therefore subject to the sharp limitations which republican, democratic governments possess. A republic cannot impose a purpose upon mankind. A democracy cannot announce a policy and then stick to it for years and decades. Americans are not messiahs. The limitations of American civilization over and above our specific political institutions are such as to make it impossible for Americans to lead a fanatical counter-crusade against communism, or to guarantee to the human race at large that Americans of 1955 promise that Americans of 1975 will perform this or that specific action. American propaganda is always limited precisely because it is American. Even in an age of atomic weapons, to be American means, to some degree at least, to be free. The people of this country, or at the very least an awful lot of them, do have something to do with operating the government. A new election and a hostile House of Representatives can cut off the funds for any project no matter what its merits may be in the eyes of the top secret planners. The outside world knows this, even if Washington politicians and bureaucrats sometimes forget. One can even contradict the title of Archibald MacLeish's famous poem, America Was Promises, and state categorically that in the propaganda field, America certainly is not promises. The promise of a czar or a dictator is usually good for his lifetime, whereas the promise of the United States is good only within the letter of the law, a specific treaty, a definite commercial agreement, a very sharp and very narrow commitment. There is an American strength in international affairs. This strength does not lie in a propaganda capacity to promise, to threaten, or to commit the United States government to future courses of action. It lies, rather, in the immense probabilities of American life, in the virtual certainty that the American people will react in such and such a fashion to a new aggression, that the American people will, if attacked, in all probability destroy their attackers, whoever those attackers may be, and that the American people, despite their occasional shortcomings in matters of racial tolerance, political freedom, and economic injustice, will in the long run be solidly ranged behind whatever policies seem to promise equality, prosperity, and freedom for all mankind. The limitations of the United States as a source of propaganda are sharp. There is no U.S. party line. It is virtually impossible to imagine that within our civilization as we now know it, there could be one. There might be an official U.S. line, unanimous and binding upon all federal departments. But the federal government itself is, after all, only one among the 49 separate governments operating within the continental USA. The state governments, the cities within them, and the people at large are free to contradict what the federal government may say at any given point. American strength cannot be sought in unanimity. U.S. propaganda is incapable of pulling the Sudeten rabbit out of a Munich hat. Short of an intimate and extreme danger of war itself, the U.S. government cannot threaten a foreign government very successfully. Too many U.S. citizens would immediately shout at one another, at their own government, and to the foreigners concerned, "Those Washington officials don't really mean it. We don't want war. We're not going to go through with it." If the USA moved against Spain, there are friends of Franco in Washington who would tell him to sit tight. If the USA moved too rapidly against the communist world, there are plenty of Americans, both in and out of government, who would say privately, through the press, or by letters that the Indian government or some other should assure Moscow and Peiping that the U.S. would not dare carry through. Exploitation of U.S. propaganda strength must therefore always be developed from the probable or apparent center of American opinion at that moment. It is impossible to find a U.S. policy which can be made compulsory and unanimous upon all Americans, both public and private. It is not impossible, through an adroit combination of the skills of leadership, foresight, and a keen awareness of intra-U.S. politics, to devise foreign policy programs which will command the decisive assent of the American people. War and unanimity. The less peaceful the world is, the more effective a peacetime information program can be. The attack of the communist aggressors in Korea, which involved the U.S. armed forces, pushed the U.S. public into line behind the U.S. government in a way which no degree of propaganda manipulation from Washington could have contrived. In times of danger, the American people stick together. In times of relaxation, they scatter about. One should not plan a crusade for the American people to carry out unless one is sure that someone on the outside will goad the American people with repeated stings of danger or trouble. Once war breaks out, the American people have in the past shown a very good capacity to unite in winning and finishing the war. There is no reason to suppose that the situation will be different in the future. What is perplexing, and for the present insoluble, is this: how can the American people, short of getting involved in war, become so purposeful, so decisive, so nearly unanimous as to take actions which will prevent a war? The situation in the early 1950s is on the communist side, a major crusade against what the Reds regarded, or pretended to regard, as aggressive U.S. capitalist power. In other words, the communists of the world had a crusade against the USA. The USA had a crusade against no one. A prominent Washington official long displayed the sign in his office, "I ain't mad at nobody." In a very real sense, this epitomized one of the very real moods of the American people. How do we defend ourselves against a crusade, especially if we have no desire to have part in a counter-crusade? U.S. propagandists sometimes forget that they are not speaking for a mere nation, but are the representatives of something which is far bigger than any single nationality. They are the spokesmen, whether they like it or not, for a way of life which is new in the world, for a kind of freedom which, though coarse, is real. Characteristic American strengths have been, are, and will be the strengths of patience, endurance, versatility, and curiosity. It is foolish to ask Americans to be strong in bitterness, strong in hatred, strong in a cruel or proud self-righteousness. We are not Japanese or Prussians or Russians. We are not Irish or English or French. We are mostly European and yet un-European. Our propaganda will be effective only if it springs from the simplest and strongest aspects of our life at home. Our material prosperity is beyond doubt. What is not so evident to the outside world is the frugality, the kindliness, and the humble foresight which drove so much of that prosperity into being. The propaganda of friendship. U.S. limitations are nowhere more evident in peacetime propaganda than in the oft-repeated phrase of winning friends for America. The desire for having a friend is a deep necessity amid the crowded loneliness of U.S. urban society. The necessity to be liked leads to grotesquely exaggerated inferences as to what being liked may involve. Americans in and out of government often argue that America should make friends on the naive assumption that friends are useful to nations in time of trouble. This is, of course, not true. The Swedes were very good friends of the Norwegians. Nevertheless, the Swedes saved their Swedish skins by sitting back when the Nazis overran Norway. Did Lithuania have an enemy? Did Latvia have an enemy? Did Estonia have an enemy? These countries were the good friends of all the Western powers. These countries have disappeared. The United States was a friend of China, a friendship boastfully and sentimentally proclaimed for more than 100 years, from the days of Daniel Webster to the finale of George C. Marshall. What use was it to the Chinese to have the United States as a friend? When they fell upon trouble, a U.S. Secretary of State denounced their government as corrupt and told the Chinese how good the United States was. Friendship does not usually lead to war or peace. War and peace depend upon survival. Any veteran will remember men whom he disliked intensely in his own wartime outfits. He never daydreamed of turning them over to the enemy just because he was personally antagonistic to them. A common danger from something more complicatedly, a common interest in something, is a far more potent assurance of future strength and strategic action than is friendship. Friendship operates between individuals, not between the overgrown corporate fictions which are called nations. If you were a West German, and if you were absolutely positive that all Americans were lovely people, you would be wise to join the Soviet side. That way, if the Russians win, you will have appeased the enigmatic and implacable Muscovites. On the other hand, if the Americans win, and you are sure they are lovely people as well as good friends of yours, they will not really mind your having joined the other side as a matter of temporary factual necessity. If a man is your best friend, he may jump into the river to rescue you, should you fall in. Unfortunately, he might prefer to telephone a rescue squad. But if he is handcuffed to you, you are reasonably sure that if you fall in, he will be with you. Call it propaganda, call it information, call it international communication. Under any name, the major point remains. Americans can find trustworthy future allies through commitment to common interest or common danger. Friendship is pleasant, but not of the essence. In some cases, it might be desirable for leaders or key groups in important foreign areas to realize that the United States could be a worse enemy than the Soviet Union, rather than to realize that the U.S. is a friend. If the French were sure of this, that is, that a Soviet-occupied France would get 65 hydrogen bombs dropped on it, while a U.S.-occupied France would get only 3, they might prefer the Americans whether they liked them or not. Is this kind of communication consistent with American ideals? Perhaps not. Yet honesty has always been one of the American ideals, and perhaps honesty may take us in the future to a stronger and a wiser position than friendliness has taken us in the past.
This concludes today's reading of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.